Hello, good afternoon, ma'am.
Hi there. Nice to be here.
Ma'am, pleasure having you here.
Oh, it's very pleasure for you to invite me. So thank you. I really appreciate it. Oh no.
Okay, so participants, welcome back to 1 week Indo-Italy workshop on research methodology. And we are honored and blessed to have with us Dr. KEELEY, who's a professor in computational intelligence at Manchester Metropolitan University. She completed her PhD in fuzzy decision trees from MMU in the year 1998. And currently she's leading the Computational Intelligence Lab at Center for Advanced Computational Science. Her research area interest includes fuzzy systems, psychological profiling using artificial interline, fuzzy natural language processing, semantic similarity, conversational agents, and intelligent tutoring system. She is academic co-lead in ERDF, 6 million euros, artificial intelligence Foundry and PI on KTP projects. And she is general co-chair of IEEE.
Okay, so I am requesting, ma'am, to please share your
Absolutely, yes.
presentation. Yes.
Absolutely. Sorry, I lost you then for a minute, but I will do that now. And then shall I just start? Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. Right, let's share my screen.
Yes, you can share, ma'am.
Thank you. So I'm hoping, can you see now? Yeah?
Yes,
can you
yes.
You can see.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Right, I will start. Okay. So first of all, I would like to thank the organising committee for this great opportunity to speak to you today at the Indo-Italy International Virtual Workshop on Research Methodology. And what I'm going to do is share some ideas and insight into building trustworthy artificial intelligence by looking at the ethical side. Sometimes as researchers in the past, maybe we don't really think about our consequences of our research more, and that's what we're going to explore today. Now, I've already had a great introduction, so I'm really just going to skim through this particular slide. But what I want to say is that even though my background has been in artificial intelligence and developing these kinds of systems over time, I do spend a significant amount of time doing lots of teaching in this area, but also in databases, and I work a lot with industry as well. So I have quite a varied role in what I actually do. So let's move on to the presentation then. In this talk, what I'm going to do is look at, give you some background and context that when you actually are a researcher developing anything that involves data or artificial intelligence, what happens if you have ethical processes and procedures in place, but they're simply not enough? So for example, here we've seen in the past few years, the Facebook analytical scandal about the use of data. In the UK, we saw a lot about the use of algorithms that decide A-level and GCSE grades for pupils. And again, these were done ethically in terms of data, but actually the media and the public, the citizens, the users of our systems were not actually happy with what happened. So we'll look at also the dynamic landscape of building trustworthy AI. We'll look at risk, okay? So what does risk mean to you when you're using a system online? It may be to apply for a student loan or a mortgage or something like that. How do you assess the risk of that system, which has been trained on data, actually giving you the right answer? And do you understand how it did that? I'm going to share some processes and procedures that we use in looking at ethical AI in academic research. And then I'll give you an overview of some of the work I'm doing, and we'll end on some toolkits. Now, I must warn you in advance, inside this presentation, there are a couple of little activities that I'm going to ask you to do. So I will be posting 2 links in the chat. I'll tell you when to do it, and I will share everything on my screen. And when you do take part, please note that everything is anonymous, okay? So let's begin. So if we think about when I first started doing my work, I was thinking and using AI algorithms to actually think about how to discover hidden patterns in data, how to develop algorithms and structures that could actually learn. And over the years, I was involved in a number of funded projects. And the game changer for me was something called border control, which I worked on between 2016 and 2019. And it was funded by Horizon 2020, the European Union. Now, the grant we had was 4.5 million euros. There were 13 partners across 9 countries in Europe. And the idea is that we wanted to create a 2-stage procedure to speed up land border crossings at Schengen borders across Europe. But at the same time, we wanted to enhance security by utilising state-of-the-art technology. And our role in this was to develop something known as ADS, an automated deception detection system, which we've been developing for actually years and have been used in other contexts. Now, the story here isn't really about the technology and the fact that lots of different partners were actually developing very unique and new things. So, for example, we did a lot of new novel data analytics research so the border guards and managers could actually look at a lot of prediction of who was going to cross borders when and where. Now, during this project, what happened was the European Commission published a story in the media. And this story was saying that border control was a good project. It was a success story. At this point, it was 2/3 of the way through. And we took the system to a number of national science festivals. When the media saw this, they went crazy. It was published in over 1,000 news websites, picked up by the media, new scientists, and even the website had 64,000 hits in one day. Now, we roll back and think about the procedures. We had ethics for each university and partner. We had European Union ethics. We had an independent ethical advisor on the use of data. We followed every single procedure and process to the latter. Yet actually, the media didn't like it, and some of the citizens didn't like it as well. So maybe the moral to this story is that that's when I started thinking, well, actually, ethical procedures are not enough. We need to step back and think about the consequences of the research that we do. So let's start at the beginning then. What is ethics? So the first line there sums it up. Good and bad, right and wrong. We all have different moral compasses. What we want to do in research is look about the quality of life impact. So if we do some research, how is it going to affect others, individuals and members of society? There's a couple of definitions on there. The second one is probably one of the clearest. It's a set of values, principles, and techniques that guide our moral conduct. And there's the word here, guide, because we're all different in the use and development of AI systems. But every time we develop new technology, new algorithms, we're then faced with new kinds of ethical dilemmas. So the question, should a device, technique, or technology be restricted because people can use it for illegal or harmful actions as well as beneficial ones? And that is a really, really big question. So AI raises, the use of artificial intelligence raises many ethical issues, mainly during the application of the results that we find. So for example, when we build a loan approval system, if we use authenticity as a factor, is that right or wrong? What happens if our system screens job applications based upon age or gender when it's not actually directly relevant to the job? And in the United States particularly, sometimes insurance coverage is declined based upon the neighborhood that people live in. It's like a postcode lottery. And when we look at some of the key areas today, they all raise problems. So with autonomous vehicles, in a scenario where a vehicle has to choose, does it kill 2 passengers or 3 pedestrians? Does it go left or right? How do we implement morals into these systems, or even can we? With autonomous weapons, what happens if the weapon is hacked? That is a massive, massive problem here. With autonomous robots, we move more into the social side, because if jobs are replaced with robots in some of the areas there, like they have been in manufacturing and farming, what's the role of the human being? Do robots have employment rights? Should they get paid? And then the ones that most of us have hit, even if you're not in computer science and AI, most of us will have been hit by some form of system that makes an automated decision based upon the data that we put in. But that data, that algorithm has been trained on a data set. Is it representative of a diverse population? Is it fair? What happens if you don't really understand the technology? So digital poverty is a really big issue now. And what happens if you don't really understand how the system's working and you get told, sorry, you've been rejected? And how does that impact your life? So who is responsible in determining what is an ethical application or not? So 3 examples here. The first one we have over here is the use of robotic pets for helping simulate cognitive functions of dementia patients. Is that right or wrong? Down here, we have the use of delivery robots, autonomous, electrical, rechargeable rovers that can deliver food within a 3/4 mile radius. They reduce emissions, they reduce congestion, they reduce costs. But what about the livelihood of the delivery drivers who they're replacing? And then at the top here, we have Moxie. Moxie works on a neurological unit in a Texas hospital. Her job is to fetch and gather. So she may take lab specimens to the lab, she may get blankets, she may help with admissions packs, etc. And the idea is to allow caregivers, especially nurses, to take more charge of caring for the patient and let the robot do the more menial tasks. Now, I did quite a number of public engagement events last year virtually, and I was asking lots of different members of the public what they thought about these applications. And what's really interesting is, again, if we take Moxie, a lot of people were concerned that if Moxie is delivering tea to a person, a patient in hospital, what happens if Moxie puts salt in the cup instead of sugar, which can kill somebody? So it's really interesting. And this is a benefit of engaging with the public and the citizens who use your tech or may use your tech to find better insights. So ethics is coming into the law in various different countries, okay? And what we've learned over the past few years is that if you have an AI system or a product, so take the UK algorithm scandal for predicting grades, then if they get bad press, it could be around the poor design, unethical applications, etc. But it can actually destroy the company that made the actual algorithm. There's lots of analysis been undertaken by academics across the world and government bodies on what constitutes ethical AI. And there are lots of publications, lots of principles, lots of guidelines out there, but it's very fragmented. There's often a focus on technology rather than how humans can actually integrate and use the system. These guidelines and principles will tell you what to do, but not actually how to implement it. And they don't give you the concrete examples that you actually need. And there's a lack of case studies. They also don't really go into detail about accountability and compliance. There's no audit trail to check, okay, you say that you're following these principles and guidelines, but who's checking up on you? So therefore, there is a significant gap between all the theory and practice and the practical adaptation of these practices across the AI value chain. Now, I know this is a research methodology workshop, but when we think about it, we have to do things the right way as researchers because we have to transfer our knowledge, our new algorithms into industry. Now, I'm not going to read this slide, but when I did an analysis last year of all the different kinds of principles from many, many documents, these were some of the key reoccurring principles that showed up. Some of these, if you're working in computer science or AI, you may think, oh yes, I know those. So for example, in AI, we want fair, unbiased systems. We also want humans to be a part of that entire process, and we want AI to be inclusive to all, regardless of educational attainment. So some of these, as we go through, you'll see coming through. But the question is, it's okay saying this, but how do we practically implement it? Okay. So this is an international workshop. I just wanted to highlight one example, and it's from the UK AI Council, and it was a roadmap published earlier this year. And this is being echoed around the world. When we develop systems, one key aspect is the involvement of citizens in the conceptualization of new AI products and services. So yes, we're saying that from a business perspective, but if you're coming up with a new research idea, why not ask? Why not go out and ask people what they think about it, would they use it? And this is required to build public trust. The second area is that we need to make sure that if we want to involve public and citizens, we want to make sure they have enough skills to be able to contribute. Teams of developers need to be diverse, and this has long been advocated that diverse teams will build better products. One of the key issues associated with deployed AI systems is in data protection and data privacy. In the UK, we have something called the Information Commissioner's Office, which recommends the number of things. It says basically that all functions and individuals responsible for development of any AI system understand, are trained, and can take part in the validation and deployment and monitoring. Making sure that the data is clearly labelled and is clear and is factual. Adopting common terminology that all stakeholders and staff can use to discuss the statistical accuracy and what it means. There's a lot there in this, but the key thing here, it says recommends. It is not a legal requirement yet. So for those countries who are in the European Union that develop and procure AI in private and public sectors, new legislation is coming. As researchers, we also need to be aware of this legislation and the impact it may have on us, particularly if we're sharing data between different research labs across the world. So this framework is called a regulatory framework at this moment on AI. And the idea is that it'll apply to everybody, public and private sectors. So in the UK, the university is a public sector organisation, and it will have a board set up to manage it. But that's not the real interesting thing. What the EU has done is tried to categorise every type of AI system or service into these areas here. So if we have a system that's classified as an acceptable risk, this means it could have harm on society. It could violate human rights. So for example, it gives an example of social scoring of governments or live remote biometric identification systems in public accessible places. These systems, the EU, when this law comes into place, will ban. We then have high-risk systems. These have an impact on people's safety or their fundamental rights. Some examples are here, but it could be things like critical infrastructure, such as transport systems, self-driving buses or cars. It could be a system that restricts a person's access to education and courses based upon, for example, their ethnicity or gender. It could be anything that influences law enforcement in the courts that interferes with a person's rights. There's a whole list of these. We have limited risk systems, which must have specific transparency requirements to be imposed. So, for example, if you're using a chatbot, we must clearly tell the user that they may be manipulated if that's the case, and the users should be aware that they're interacting with a machine. And lastly, we have minimal risk, and they classify all other AI systems. Now, you probably gathered, I just reamed off there a few examples, but it's very, very limited to what these will be. And they're going to have a body in place that's going to actually assess the high-risk AI systems, and a number of documents and procedures will have to be followed for companies. We don't know yet whether it affects universities, at what level, and they'll be recorded in a database. Now, this legislation has been discussed for a while, and I can see somebody with their hand up. I'm not sure whether I should take questions or carry on. Okay, I will carry on unless the host tells me not to. So the EU framework for AI that has been developed has had lots of different arguments. I mean, what is a low risk and high risk system? And people in research and academics say this needs to be really, really clearly defined, because there is a big debate about what it is. And if we leave it to the lawmakers, the people in the courts to actually decide, then we may have a bigger issue because they don't know the technology as well as us. So my next question is, how do you assess risk? Okay. So adopting a risk-based approach to AI relies on individual perception. What you can see here is a packet of pain relief tablets that are clearly available in the UK, over-the-counter, supermarkets, general stores, etc. When we buy these tablets, we then look at the packaging inside. And in this particular example, it says what the risk is of taking that pain relief medication. So you'll see that in here, in the trials, 1 in 1,000 people to 1 in 100 had stomach discomfort. We can see here, if we go down, that 1 in 10,000 people may have generated or got a stomach ulcer. The question I will ask you is that if you're in a position to buy this kind of pain relief, do you ever read the label? Do you ever read the detail? Okay. When you use an AI system, do you ever read the risks associated with it? So I am going to explain a scenario now and pause for a few minutes to get your opinions. You do not need to know AI in detail, because this is a tool that anybody could use. It's a human resources recruitment tool, and to assist with future job vacancies, it identifies certain traits and criteria to predict which candidates will be a good fit for your organisation. It's based on an algorithm that's been built from 6,000 historical records. And just to tell you now that the recruitment procedure has changed over the years. In that data set, there are 1,500 females, 4,000 males, and 5,000 not disclosed. And this criteria, what we call features and attributes, can be both numeric and textual. And what our AI has done is built a set of rules that classify whether a person who applies for a job gets an interview or not. So it's like a pre-screening. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to think about 2 questions, and what we're going to do is post to something called a Padlet. While I show you how to do that, 2 things to think about. What is the risk to the candidate and what is the risk to the company? They're the 2 questions. So if you were a candidate applying for this job and you had this information in front of you, what do you think the risk is? And what do you think the risk is for the company? So in order to do this, I am going to share a different screen. I'm going to go to the chat. So I'm just going to stop sharing this one for a moment. Bear with me. Let's just share everything. I'm going to go to the chat, which I'm hoping I can now access. And in the chat, I am going to post, if I can, if I have the rights to post, a Padlet link.
Yes, ma'am, you can post. Yes.
Okay, absolutely excellent.
Yes, you can post.
Yep, the chat's disappeared, but it's here. And what I would like you to do, okay, is click on that link and you will see the following screen in front of you. Okay, I'm just going to move the chat out of the way. I'm running out of boxes here. So what I would really love is if somebody can indicate when they can see this screen that I am sharing with you now. So I'd be very grateful if anyone can post in the chat if they can just see the screen. Just one person would be fantastic. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Okay, so let's have a look at this. So in order to use Padlets, there's going to be 2 of these in this talk. You can see here there is 2 questions on the screen, okay? And at the top, I've just put the scenario again about the HR recruitment tool activity. And I just want you to think, so how do you do it? You can see this button at the bottom here. If I click on this, okay, it generates something called a post-it note. So let me move the chat out of the way. And what you can do is you can write something. So we've got 2 questions here, the risk to the candidate and the risk to the company. What I would like you to do is just take a couple of minutes and write down what you think the risks are of using this tool to each one of these. As soon as you've typed something on here, click publish and it will appear and your comments will be anonymous. I'm just going to spend 2 to 3 minutes and let's see if we get any good answers. And do not be afraid to do it. If you're actually struggling to think of something, just imagine that you finish your master's or your PhD and you're going to apply for a job somewhere. You filled in an online application and you click submit and it's going to come back and say, sorry, you don't get an interview, or sorry, yes, you do get an interview. So think about it from that perspective. If you're working in the field of artificial intelligence, then, or computer science, then you may think about the number of records for each gender. So if you remember, the number of records was quite unbalanced. What's the implication of that, do you think? Oh, 2 people have raised their hands. I'd be very grateful, because I have no control of the hand raising. If you can use the Padlet and click on the red button and paste, that will be absolutely amazing. I do appreciate people are joining from different ways. I can see here that someone's put a comment in already. And I think that's great. The system may restrict the possibility of diversity in the team. Absolutely. And the reason for that is because the data is so unbalanced towards males. So because there's more male, it may favour more male applicants because simply it has more data. Okay, I'm just going to wait 1 more minute, see if we get anything else coming in. You may all be a little shy, and I appreciate this is possibly very new to you. You may not have used it before. We tend to use it a lot to get opinions very, very quickly in lectures. Okay, so just to summarise, the risk to the candidate. I get told that I have not got an interview, but how? How do I know that? How can I get the company to explain why I didn't get an interview? Okay. Do we ask people to explain? Yes, because if it's a human who rejects us, we would email and try and get some information. I admit we tend to get a very general response. Right, so someone else has said there may be a chance that a candidate may miss important information that may be useful for the job. Absolutely. The algorithm will select those features or attributes from that data that it thinks best classify whether a person gets an interview or not, and it may miss certain things, particularly with text-based fields. And we've got one here where the AI system may reject a potential application based on an algorithm which may not be an ideal parameter or is based on subjective experience. That is absolutely fantastic. We're coming on to that in a minute, okay? Subjective experiences in labeling the training data by a human prior to that may influence the algorithm. Okay, I'm going to go back now to the presentation and we'll carry on. But thank you for your insight into that. And for those of you who are interested, as you can see, if you click on this link, I'll make the slides available afterwards. This is actually quite normal. This is an example of a software company that uses a chatbot to do just this. And no, we don't know what data it uses. So consider this following example. A bank develops a system to calculate the credit risk of potential customers. The bank uses the system to approve or reject a loan application. It's trained on a large data set containing a range of information. You can see here, occupation, income, age. And during testing, the bank wants to check against any possible gender bias and finds the system tends to give women lower credit scores. Now, as AI systems learn from data which may be unbalanced, as we've just seen, they may reflect discrimination and they may produce outputs which are discriminatory based upon gender, race, health, religion, etc. And the fact that AI systems learn from data does not guarantee that their outputs will not lead to these discriminatory effects. The data used to train and test these systems, as well as the way they design and use, may lead to AI systems which treat certain groups less favorably than others. Now, the question was, if we were a user in this system here, we would not know that it was, say, an imbalance in the training data that caused this outcome to happen. And this is a problem. One more thing to say on this one. Somebody else picked up that the training data may reflect past discrimination, and that's absolutely true. So if you have different humans scoring against different loans or different job applications, then their subjective bias may come into that labeling process, and therefore the system would actually learn that bias itself. So when we look at AI, we have to look at the risk factors that are associated with it. There is definitely a clear relationship between the risk that we perceive in an AI system and how much we actually trust it and how that risk is actually measured. And what we find that we're always trying to strive a balance between how much risk should an individual have compared with how much risk society should have. And this does largely depend upon the applications. On this screen, you'll see a series of risk factors. Each one of these is a lecture in itself. So just to give you a few highlights and tasters. Bias, when we look at this, is the biggest risk in AI. And this includes bias that is embedded into organizational or industrial cultures, personal bias, unconscious bias, and of course, the big one, data bias. And data bias must be considered and addressed in the selection of training and testing data. We've already said that data labeled by humans is subjective. And we may need to develop different models for different genders and different cultures because it may not be possible to have a model that generalizes for everybody. We also look at fairness. We need to treat people equally. So fairness is concerned with actions, processes, and consequences that are morally right. In essence, the virtue of fairness establishes moral standards for decisions that affect others and the societal impacts that we actually have. We also have to look at explaining decisions. You'll see there I've grouped these separately. This is developing algorithms that are explainable, which is more technical, but there's also explaining decisions to the user, the person who uses that system in a language that they understand. We have to tackle the issues of responsibility and accountability. So who is responsible for the process and what accountability tasks have we built into our processes to say, oh, it's this person or this group of people who are accountable for this pass. For example, data collection. We've covered societal impacts. Our systems need to be usable and reliable to build trust. We need to have good data governance and privacy in place. And we also have to have a new layer looking at AI governance and how we manage the development of our systems and algorithms. And lastly, what about the technical safety of autonomous systems such as self-driving cars? Who's responsible then? So what you can see on here is kind of trying to bring everything together. AI ethics needs to be examined from many dimensions, and AI has to be held accountable in some way. There are many factors of influence ensuring AI is built as a responsible technology. We need to make sure that the public scrutinise this. We need to actually follow the appropriate legal frameworks for our countries. And we need a method for checking. So it's okay saying we followed it, but who's actually going to check? Some of the work I'm doing with small businesses don't tend to always follow everything precisely. And they say to me, well, we're not Facebook, we're never going to get audited in compliance. But all it takes is one customer to put a complaint in the UK to the ICO, and then that process will be revealed. And of course, we've got to work with our governments. Now, what you can see here is a pyramid. At the top is the impact explosion. What happens if we don't do nothing? And again, I go back to the A-level grade algorithm that was used in the UK. If we don't do anything, we get media explosion and possible damage to the company who actually developed the algorithm and the researchers. So what we need to do is make sure we have a transparent design process. We need to look at explainability, both of the process that we use to develop the algorithms and the outcome. Define roles of accountability. Look at the different dimensions of responsibility, so social, ethical, legal, environmental, there's many. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that everybody is educated and trained, and not just the stakeholders in the research teams, in the businesses, but also to some degree the citizens we want to involve when we're developing and co-producing these systems. Okay, so I'm going to now look at some ethical examples of procedures that we use in academic research. The first one is in the subject of research governance. And most universities will tend to have this framework and principles that are actually in place to ensure that we do good quality research that's consistent with high standards. Why do we need to do this? Well, we need to make sure that we have good research data management. Our research is open access, so people can use it, scrutinise it and build on it. And we follow policies associated with research integrity. And the reason why we do it, if we look at this list here, I'm not going to read all of them out, but if we look at the fact that we really want to safeguard our participants that we use in our research. We want to have clear frameworks that are audited and checked in place, and we want to minimise the risk. Now, all universities will have an ethical policy, and that includes your own. The features on yours set out a series of ethical principles and an ethical academic code of conduct, which includes safe and secure data management, where basically researchers take steps to retain all research materials that are gathered, storing them in a confidential space for 5 years. So that's what your policy says, and the use of good consent procedures. So research ethics, moving on from that, is principles that guide you how you should work with people. Now, this can just be, say, data for a mortgage application, a job application, or it could be biological data or human tissue. How you work with your fellow researchers and colleagues, users of your research, and anybody you engage with, particularly in research-informed teaching, but also transferring research and knowledge into industry. In our own university, PhD students and researchers need to apply for university ethics approval for every single project we undertake, and that includes undergraduate students too. And we have many different processes for ethical approval, depending upon the type of project and the type of data that we want to use. We have a system called Ethos, which is an electronic system where you have to put in your application, and reviews go to an ethics board, and it can take up to 30 days to get the first decision. And we have a rule that you can't start a project until you've gone through the ethical process. And this means that even if you're doing an anonymous survey, you're doing anonymous questionnaires, you are sharing data that you've generated from another university's research team, we still have to go through this particular process. There's links at the bottom of each slide, which I'll share with you later if you want to find out more. So in the UK, currently, I say currently, we follow the General Data Protection Register, which was set up in 2018 by the European Union. And it's a legal requirement for the EU and any countries that it transfers data. And this includes research establishments. Now, in terms of when we share data as a university, our justification for collecting data is for the public task. So that's what we collect for. This means that when we undertake research in the university, it's always of interest to the public, and we should therefore publish those results, which we do through papers and journals. So in the UK or the EU, we will definitely always rely on this public task linked to the GDPR as a reason and justification for collecting that data. So I just want to show you now a couple of consent forms that we actually go through. And the reason why I do this is that when I talk to people, we have quite a very intensive process for ethical research, probably more so than other universities in the UK, given the people I've worked with. And what we have here is on the web, again, it's open access. You can see some examples of these templates, which are in Word, if you want to look at them. And when we do a consent form, we're asking people, can we use their data? Now, our university is, how can I say this? It's not just standard ethics in research, it goes beyond that. So if I do an anonymous survey or questionnaire, I still need consent to do that. So we avoid jargon, use simple English or the language of your choice, and we also need to be able to translate into multiple languages. We need to make sure that the form for consent is accessible, so we have to think about the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And this means that our research methodology for, say, conducting an experiment has to be very rigorous before we even start this process. And it's also useful that when we write these, we ask a non-scientist or a non-technical person to read them to make sure the language is clear. As well as a consent form, we also have to do something called a participant information sheet. And these can actually get quite long. Again, you can access these sample forms through that other link I've shown you if they're of interest to you. And from this sheet, what we need to do is say, why have people been invited to take part? What happens if they decide, they read this and say, hey, I don't want to do this work anymore? What will they be asked to do in clear statements? Any risks to them? What happens to any data they provide? So for example, if you are conducting a forum in a classroom and you're collecting the opinions of people verbally and writing them down, that is still an opinion that belongs to that person. So therefore, we'd still need consent to be able to use it. So storage of data. And then the second sheet here just gives us some legal speak, okay? This is all to do with the GDPR and the fact we have to be compliant towards it. And there's a set of texts that legal authorities prepare that we have to include. We also, on the participant information sheet, give information about who to contact if a person has concerns with the study. And again, we also have to include not only staff who are running the project, the PhD student, the research staff, etc. We also have to include the Information Commissioner's Office. So as you can see, it's quite strict and rigid, but you do learn a lot by filling them in. So let's talk a little bit more now about data. When using a model that's been generated by a machine learning algorithm, it will generally infer potentially new patterns and rules from a training set of data. Questions are, has a person given consent to use their data in this way to infer new information? And what are their rights if they decide to remove that data from your process? And what happens to your models and algorithms that you've created from that data? There are many issues surrounding data privacy that you also need to consider from a number of different perspectives. So one of the ways to do this is to do something called a data privacy impact assessment. Okay, now since the GDPR that came out in May 2018, it's quite interesting because it came out and said that if you're processing, which is what we're doing when we're developing new algorithms, new data models, if it's high risk to a person, okay, then we need to conduct one of these assessments and really dig deep into the data and justify why we need it. So it talks about the use of personal data quite a lot. However, the processing side involves the use of innovative technologies or the novel application of existing technologies, including AI. So let's explore what it means by innovative technologies. Examples of these include any systems or processing that involves AI, machine learning, and also deep learning. And it also gives you a list of the type of systems. So this means that when we're using any kind of data associated with all these things here, you can see things like autonomous vehicles, you can look about wearable technologies like smartwatches, okay, you can look at things that are generated by Internet of Things applications, then we still need to look at the data and dig deeper. So whenever you're using personal data to train a new AI system or make any kind of predictions, then you have to justify the lawful basis to do so. So if it's the public task, it means we still have to justify the use of every feature and attribute in the data that we use. So when you're using artificial intelligence and you're using data, think about the features that you are using. Because the key message here is we have to treat everybody equal and not discriminate. If we look at this little diagram here, we can see using any of the properties around the outside will require a proper justification and must be strictly limited. So we have to really keenly justify every single one of these features that we actually use. And the key is to just not discriminate. Under data protection law, in the UK and in the EU, individuals have a number of rights relating to all the personal data that they store. And within artificial intelligence, these rights apply whenever personal data is used at any point in the development and deployment lifecycle of an AI system or product. And this is quite important. So therefore, as a researcher, you need to consider some of the following questions. How do individual rights apply to different stages of the AI lifecycle? So you have this personal data of somebody applying for a loan, a decision, okay? You have that data to build your model, but the individual says, I now want to withdraw my information. What's the impact? How do individual rights relating to solely automated decisions with legal or similar effect? So what this means is that if a system, if I'm going to apply for an online loan, I put my data in and it says, sorry, you've been rejected. What's my rights then? Do I have a right to speak to a human within the company? And also, how are humans overseeing the process? So think about this. If you build a model that goes behind a loan acceptance or rejection system, how often do you keep retraining your model? Should you do it weekly or monthly? Who's labeling that data? Okay, so where is the human involved in the process? So another question, again, on data privacy is what about security of data? And also there's a principle on data minimization. AI requires lots of data in order to build more effective models. Whereas the law on data protection in the GDPR says only use the minimal amount of data you need. So there's a bit of contradiction there. So I just want to give you an example. Excuse me. The recruiter here hires a machine learning engineer to build an automated CV filtering system using a language called Python. And this framework that's being used to develop it requires something called open source programming libraries, which need to be downloaded on the recruiter's system. So open source means these libraries have been developed by a number of different programmers and researchers and are available for use. So one of the libraries contains a function to convert the raw training data into the format required to train the model, and it has a security vulnerability. An attacker has introduced and executed malicious code remotely to the system by disguising it as training data. Okay, this is a vulnerability. So there is a risk that when we use open source data and open source libraries like Python, how do we ensure, okay, how do we protect against these third-party frameworks and code libraries if there is malicious code that's actually in them? So we know that very few organizations and even researchers will build an AI system entirely in-house. In most cases, the design, building and running of the systems will be provided, at least in some cases, by third parties. And even if you have your own team of machine learning engineers, you may still rely significantly on these third-party frameworks and libraries because they're open source and easily available. But the drawback, the message from this, is that these standard frameworks often depend on lots of pieces of software being installed on an IT system. And to just give you an idea of the sense of risk involved, a recent study, okay, found that the most popular frameworks, I will not name them, include up to 887,000 lines of code and rely on 137 external dependencies. So there is a lot of areas there where malicious code could be introduced. And this obviously affects the model. So something to think about. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to some tools that you may want to think about to support ethical AI. I've included a couple of references, partly because we're very interested on what tools are available that not only academics, researchers, universities, but small businesses can actually use to try and start thinking more about the ethical use of AI. This is just a very small snapshot. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about explaining decisions with AI guidance. And note the word again, guidance, it is not legal. In May 2020, the Information Commissioner's Office and the Alan Turing Institute in the UK published this guidance on explaining decisions made with AI. It's a very lengthy guidance, has 3 parts, and it was designed originally for businesses to follow. It comprises lots and lots of different checklists for different stakeholders. So you may have a CEO who's not technical, you'll have a chief technical officer, you'll have data scientists, you'll have testers, you'll have product and marketing. So the idea is that everybody, every stakeholder can have a say and understand how AI makes decisions. So just a brief overview of what this looks like. It introduces 2 kinds of explanations. First of all, something called a process explanation of AI systems about demonstrating that you have followed good data and AI governance processes and best practices when you've designed it, such as inclusivity and teams. There's also outcome-based explanations, which are clarifying the results of a specific decision made by the model that you have trained. It also includes a number of different explanation types. Okay, so just to go through a few of them: responsibility, who is responsible for the system and the decisions, and who can a user contact to query it, and how much human responsibility and oversight do you have? Data, people want to know about data about them that's used in the training model. Do you have a process where they can find out? Fairness, can we justify that a person has been treated the same as everyone else? Safety and performance, how accurate is the system and how is it assured that I'm getting the same accuracy as everybody else? And impact, what is the impact of the decision that I get back from that system on me and on society as a whole? Now, after defining those explanation types, the guidance suggests a series of tasks for extracting and delivering explanations. This is not a rigid process, and you can do it concurrently. Now, I'm not going to read through every single thing on the slide here, but you can actually see those steps appear quite short, but actually they comprise of many, many checklists. So imagine if you're a small company who's developed a really new innovative AI product, okay? Have you gone through and looked at explanations at all these different levels? Okay, so there's quite a lot of work to be done. We did some work with many different SMEs in the UK, and they found it useful, but just too much and would take too much time and did not have the resources to be able to do this. Moving more to the academic side now, which is quite interesting. There's a standardized process for documenting data sets developed by Google, Microsoft, and some US universities. And the source and the link for that paper is on the slide. And the idea was to facilitate how we communicate the data set, how it was made, to both the creators and the consumers, the users of our system, to enable transparency and accountability for the model. So it's a really good idea, but what we found out is I have some master's students who've been evaluating this work, and it's very, very difficult if you want to apply this to a third-party data set because you don't have the information. So therefore, it's quite limited in terms of if you're an organization or a researcher collecting your own data, but it's still a good idea and a step in the right direction. Model cards for model reporting complements the data sheets for data sets, and it aims to standardize the ethical practice and reporting, allowing stakeholders to compare different kinds of models that they've developed from the data for deployment. And it doesn't just use traditional evaluation metrics, but also looks at ethical issues, inclusivity, bias, and fairness. This one is moved on from being a paper and was designed by Google, and you can link and find example model cards and templates here. And it's actually designed for different kinds of stakeholders. And what happens is you define a model from your data, and then you will complete one of these and you can use it to assess the risk. Again, it's not used as one thing and that's it, tick the box. It's part of a larger toolkit because the models are very complex. One of the issues here is trying to explain it to different kinds of stakeholders who may not have that same technical background. But again, step in the right direction. A third toolkit is known as consequence scanning, and this is relatively new. And this toolkit has been designed for everybody, the public, business, citizens, you name it. So you don't have to have AI or computer science experience. It can actually also be applied to any kind of area. So the question is, how much do you think through the consequences of your research or technology? The idea is you think of a new idea, right? And you think about the impact it has on people and society, not just before you invest in the development, but going through the stages. So it's almost like if you're doing a PhD and you develop a project, think about what the impact will be at the early stages, and that might change or shift how you actually create your research methodology. So consequence scanning is usually used at the early stages, which I've mentioned. There's a wide variety of stakeholders, as you can see here. And you can see here that this is known as an Agile planning onion, very new. I didn't invent it, it was the consequence scanner people. And you can see here that when would you do this? You won't just do it at the beginning, but every time you introduced a new feature or service, when you're developing the roadmap for a potential product, and again at that initial conception stage. So consequence scanning is good because it can be done very quickly, and it just has 3 different questions. The first one, what are the intended and unintended consequences of the product or feature, the new tech that you're trying to develop? Consequences are the result of an action, and they might be intended, unintended, positive or negative. Intended consequences are the change or impact you are looking to make. These are your project requirements, what you want to achieve. Unintended consequences are what would happen as a result of your actions. What have you learned from similar products that have been released throughout history? And this is where you think about what you might be missing, how what you've created could be used in ways you didn't intend, and what are the knock-on effects. Finally, if we do have unintended consequences, what do we want to do for mitigation? Okay, how do we want to mitigate any potential harms to the organization, the university, the business, to the users, etc., and how are we going to communicate that? So I'm looking at the time, it's 10:21, and what I would like to know is I have one other little activity here. I am going to try and do it because I think it's important, just to give you an idea. And this one is something to think about. So you're going to create an advertisement profiler. And what this does is you go into a taxi and there's a camera that looks at your face and it looks at your emotions. And depending upon your emotions, it sends you different advertisements, depending on how you're feeling, okay? It may store the fact you've been in the taxi before, so it has a history of you and it knows who you are. So what it's trying to do is target ads based upon your emotions of your face, okay? Now I'm gonna click on here, on this link. I'm gonna post it into the chat as well. So just give me a second. This is the second one. And I'm hoping now you've had a go at Padlet, you may be able to have a go at this one. So what I'm going to do, I've pasted this link in the chat. I am going to switch back my screen now to the Padlet, many things on. And this one is the consequence scanning. So what I want you to do is think about, if I'm doing this advertisement profiler that looks at my face and gives me happy or sad advertisements, or I don't know, if I'm angry, it may show some anger management courses or something like that. Do you think it's good or bad? So what are the unintended consequences? What might happen to somebody? Think about if they get the wrong advertisement. And what are the intended consequences of this system? If you're a business, you may sell more products. So have a think about that. We're just going to take a couple of minutes because I'm aware of the time, but I think it's important you just have a think about it. Again, for those who have joined us slightly late, you'll see this screen here. If you click on the chat link that I've posted to take part in this activity, if you go to the if you go to this red sign here and click on it, you're able to write something under here, and when you publish it, it will appear on the screen. All comments are anonymous, and I think that's quite important. Well, I want you to have a think about it just for a couple of minutes. Let's see if anybody posts anything.
Sir,
I guess I'm looking for somebody who might be brave.
File copy करी थी. Do you know that? If
I think you're all being very, very quiet, so I'll just keep talking.
second time पैसा.
So the question is, if you were feeling really, really, really upset because something had happened, and yeah, that's right, somebody's put in there, the ads may offend the person since they don't know the person well. Absolutely. Let's think about if you were a person who was all dressed up, you were going to visit a friend, say for dinner, and you were in this particular taxi. Then it might show you an advertisement for flowers or chocolates or a gift. And you might think, oh, that's a really, really good idea. On your phone, you order it and send it. But then starts to profile you, remember, because it remembers your face from the next time you visit the taxi. But think about your data being stored as well. Your facial biometric data. No consent is being given. Yep, influencing the targeted audience and driving their decision into buying. So it's a form of profiling. That's what they're trying to do. I'll even put profiling on here because I think that's quite important. If I can spell it. Okay. So it's almost like that if you were in this taxi, did you know your data was being used? Did you give consent for it to be used in this way? Are they going to just delete your facial profile afterwards, or are they going to store it so they can build that up? And what happens if you say, actually, I don't want to do this? Will they be able to remove your data, and how is it managed? And the reason why I chose this particular example is I've read some research papers in a company that is starting to do this now. So it's actually what we call a knowledge transfer project, and they're hitting loads of issues with regards to the ethics. So it's an interesting one. What's this space? Okay, so because of the time, it's something I'd like you to think about in the future in your own research and that you develop, and we'll move on now with the presentation. So going forward, how do we as researchers be ahead of the curve and deliver responsible tech? It would be great if we all had a really good ethical platform to work within. And I guess our university, like many others, is on this journey. Large businesses such as IBM and Google are already moving in that direction and have got that framework in place. But for small businesses and others, they're still trying to catch up, and there's lots of work to be done there. I just wanted to share with you one of the best ethical platforms I've seen, and it was by a man called David Leslie at the Alan Turing Institute. But again, it requires quite a lot of resources to actually deliver. Setting up an ethical platform for responsible AI project delivery involves not only building the culture from the ground up, it involves providing the team of researchers, developers, the means to be able to accomplish the goals of establishing ethical permissibility, fairness, trustworthiness, and justification for every individual project. Now, what you can see on this slide is a couple of things. At the both basic level, it necessitates that you gain a working knowledge of a framework of ethical values that support, underwrite, and motivate responsible data design and the use of some kind of ecosystem. These are referred to in this model as the sum values, okay? And again, I haven't got time to go into all of them, but just looking at these, they're really, really important. The objectives of these values are to provide you with a framework to start thinking about the moral scope of the societal and ethical impacts of your research. They're also designed to establish criteria to evaluate the ethics. We then have fast-track principles here. These are actionable principles that facilitate an orientation to responsible design. Okay, there are 4 of them. And then lastly, at the top, we have a governance framework. So we may have a data governance framework in place that's driven by our university or by legislation, but what we need to do now is incorporate AI governance into that process. One of the questions is, how much time should be spent invested in creating such a platform and framework for our universities, our businesses, etc. And with the legal framework changing, we have to be very mindful that we may have to adjust it. So again, I'll send these links to you, but there is a link there at the bottom if you want to find out more. So I'm just going to end on some recent work. Clearly, the world is changing. I have looked at policies from UNESCO, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, you name it, right? And everybody is saying 2 clear messages, right? Number 1, we need to have explainability. We need to understand our AI. We need to assess the risk, and we need to get citizens involved. So last year, from June 2020 to April 21, we've been working on trying to embed practical ethics into businesses, particularly those which are small to medium, less than 250 employees. So this is kind of like a knowledge exchange project. And what we did was we worked with people in government, we worked with local authorities and businesses to create this inquiry that was called Our Place, Our Data. And we asked local people in different parts of the UK about data, AI, how it was used, and how it could help in the COVID recovery period. So the idea is that the clear message here was, again, Citizens need to be involved to actually enable them to trust us. The other major thing from this report, okay, was that citizens need to be involved in the conceptualization of AI products and services. They may not know the technology. They may not have the education to be able to understand how the algorithms worked. Or I must say that we must need to address that problem as well. But what they do have is a moral compass, and that is so, so valuable in what we do. The report had 5 key recommendations. Again, don't have a lot of time to go through these, but it was emphasising again the idea that we can't do this alone as a university. It needs to be nationally. It needs to take into consideration international policies and procedures and the law as well. The public-private sector must work together. So businesses can't just develop tech. They need to get the public involved to build that trust, and it needs to be coherent and consistent. We also did a lot of work on open data sets as well, making sure we've got consent to use them and making sure that different sectors can actually share the information in a legal way. I won't go through these too much. But obviously, data is not separate from AI. It's part of AI. It's fundamental. So therefore, we should work. So we should work more with businesses to transfer our knowledge about research methodologies and data to develop new strategies for businesses to grow. So 5 key recommendations that were made there. A second recent work that was currently live at the moment, which is all about transferring that knowledge of ethics into businesses, is something called the AI Foundry. And as you can see at the bottom, it's a European Union project, and there's quite a number of universities in the UK that are involved, and Manchester Metropolitan University are leading this. Now, what's special about this Foundry, okay, is what we're trying to do is think about AI research in universities. What we're doing is we're working with businesses. They may have an idea. We have the skill set as AI researchers and developers to make it reality. So what we're trying to do is marry the two together, increase the performance of these businesses by developing new innovative AI projects and doing research with them. So we're doing research methodologies. We're actually building and creating them. I have a technical team that's doing that. And it's actually really, really beneficial. And what we're trying to do over 3 years is develop 30 new AI products or services and support 170 small businesses. Now, SME is what you can see on the slide. In the UK and Europe, an SME is up to 250 employees. So that's our definition of the companies we're trying to work with. Now, what's really special and what's different what we're doing is when these businesses come to us, so we run a new set every 3 months, we roughly get 30 businesses coming in. And what we do is we have these conferences and strategy workshops. And during those, what we've introduced, which is new, is a 3-hour workshop on AI ethics and developing responsible tech. The people who come to these workshops, we may get a data scientist, but we often get CEOs, we often get product specialists, marketing, we have very large groups, and we do things like consequence scanning on their individual ideas. So on this AI Foundry, once they've gone through a series of research, which includes business development, etc., they then they develop a business plan, and then they work with our technical AI's teams to actually develop proof of concept products that can be evaluated and taken to market. And lastly, last thing, which is really interesting, because I'm so passionate about the use of the public and citizens in developing our new technology, I've been working with a company called AI Tech North. And what we've done is we've created a documentary and also a publication on public intelligence. So we're looking at universal principles to practically embed ethics into decision-making, design thinking, and development of products. So there's a wide range of people who are contributing to that. Very pleased to be working with the United Nations on this, as well as lawyers, etc. So it's a really interesting thing. And again, if you're interested, please have a look at that. So to end, because I'm slightly over and I do apologize, okay? How do researchers build trustworthy AI? So the key word on the slide is be ahead of the curve. Your university has an ethical policy. Follow it. See if you can adopt it. Check any restrictions on data protection and data privacy. Remember, if you're sharing data with research groups that are international, you may have to apply to certain legislation. Get consent. Check out if you're using third-party data sets and models. Is consent needed, right? Consent for all personal information. Now, when we develop a system, we generally get a complex model. This will lead to many more additional ethical questions that are not typically addressed. For example, the consequence scanning. So what we need to do is think about impact assessments, including risk. Look at your own research. Work on what's affected by potential applications of AI or decisions informed by the use of AI. If you're not working in artificial intelligence, think about what you're trying to do, the results, the data that you're using. Do some consequence scanning. Think about explainability. So this is more about explaining your results to stakeholders. You need to do that. If we look at the AI context there, we're looking at making sure we can explain the AI decision. If there's anybody on here doing deep learning, this has more significant challenges, as you can imagine. Examine responsibility and accountability. This can be done in the consequence scanning stage, but also can be done by looking at your ethics and data AI governance policies. Okay, so who's accountable for the AI decision? When we're in research, we can actually explain to the user a lot more when we're doing trials and tests and getting people to try out systems. We can explore different ways to explain accountability to them. And lastly, I do encourage public engagement with research. Go out there, take out your research, get the public, members of the public to comment on it, use it, try it out, and you'll be surprised at some of the issues that are raised. Going back to the start of the journey when I looked at border control and we did that press conference in 2018, yeah, we weren't doing anything wrong. We've been working on psychological profiling using AI for absolutely years. We had all the consent in place, but clearly it was very, very contentious. There was a lot of misunderstanding about how that system was going to be used. None of these issues were raised by that first round at the Science Festival. It was by other people. So we learned a lot from that process. But I still advocate using the public to ensure quality and acceptance of research before you invest a lot of time in it. So to summarize then, ethical and responsible AI is evolving at a very rapid pace. Legislation is changing. As we know that the UK decided to opt out of the EU. Therefore, in the last week, I do know that the UK is possibly not going to adopt the AI framework for legislation. They're going to be working on developing their own. I think that citizen involvement is essential if you want people to trust and use your product, especially if you're transferring your research to industry. There's a growing demand for tools to bridge that gap to support explainability of decisions. And if you really want to contribute to some bigger work that I'm doing, there's a survey here and I'm very interested in your opinions on AI, so you can have a look at that. And if you want to look at moral machines further and think about the impact of ethics, there's an absolutely fantastic toolkit to do in your own time. It's called Moral Machines. It's linked. The link of this is here. Try it out and see what you think. Very, very interesting. I would like to say thank you very, very much for listening. It has been a long presentation, so I really, really do appreciate your time. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now. Ooh, sorry for overrunning.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, ma'am. Dear participant, if you have any query, please you can ask. If you have any query, you can unmute yourself. Okay, I think there is no query. So thank you, ma'am, for providing this such a fruitful information for the risk assessment in the HR recruitment, as well as on the risk of bias and discrimination in the model and risk factor in artificial intelligence. You have also discussed about how to develop an ethical, responsible, and trustworthy artificial intelligence. You have discussed about the ethical AI in research governance, informed consent, and you have also shown several samples for the consent form for the academic research, the participant information sheet sample, as well as AI decision guidance, and many much more that certainly will be fruitful for our audience. So thank you so much, ma'am. I am inviting our Dean UCRD, Meenakshi ma'am, for that token of love of token from the Galgotia University. So Meenakshi ma'am, please. Meenakshi ma'am,
thank you so much,
here?
Professor
Yes.
Kelly. Now yes, my voice is audible.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Yes.
It's been my greatest privilege. I apologize for going on slightly too long. And I'd just like to say, if anybody's got any questions or anything, you can always email me.
In the chat box where everyone is, there is no any question. There was a very informative session. So thank you so much, Professor Kelly, to accept the memento as
Thank
from
you
our
so
side
much.
a token of love and gratitude from our side. Thank you, ma'am, for guidance and faculty members. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gaurav.
If anyone have any query, please. Yes. Yes, there is one query. Thank you, ma'am. There is one query. Rajshri, you can unmute yourself and you can ask. Her question is, what are the limitations for using AI in serious illness conversation?
Okay, I can only add a perspective on this. First of all, I do not believe AI should be left to talk about anything to do with illness from any different models on its own. And by that, I mean a talking conversational agent. I believe that a human in the loop is always required. So that means that an AI could be used maybe to scan images, to show where there's potential tumors or predict growth. But I think it is the human experts, the doctors and the consultants who should use that to help inform their decision rather than rely completely on AI to do this. I have conducted a number of surveys with the public over the years. I've just sent off for review another review on this, and it is clearly over time people do not want to use AI when they're looking at anything to do with medical processes or decisions that are made. They still rely on the fact that a human is the main person who should be talking about this. And I think it's really difficult because you can say, well, I can combine the images from thousands of different samples together. I think that's great. But I think the AI should have the explainability and the reason in place to justify why it thinks potentially someone may, say, have cancer or not. And I think that should be combined with human experts only and not a singular AI decision. But that's just my opinion. I can see there are a few other questions that are coming in the chat now. I try to not talk about AI in defence sector. I work on IEEE with a task force on social and ethical implications, and I work with a professor called Matt Garrett. He's at the University of New South Wales in Australia, and they have quite a lot of work with AI in defence. I think there are lots of issues. I think that some places, some countries have decided to ban certain things, such, for example, the use of AI in drones. I think that's a really good thing. I don't advocate it, because if you're using image recognition in a drone to go and attack a place location, we know that image recognition is not 100%, so how can you be absolutely sure? But again, that's my personal opinion, okay? So I wish you could speak, because you've said using a model like GPT-3 for just engagement, but not decision-making, since clinicians shy away from such conversations. So I'm not sure what the GPT-3 model is. I'm really sorry. I don't know about that. So it'd be great if you could unmute.
Yes, sorry, I couldn't. Hi, Dr. Crockett. So what I wanted to ask is, I'm not a developer. I am not into development. I am only a psychologist. What I had been interested in, I recently came across a paper about this OpenAI's GPT-3. So it's a great communication model, great writing model, and they understand that there could be potential risks if GPT-3 would be used in writing research papers. So if you could have a look at this GPT-3 software. What I wanted to ask was, if I work in the field of palliative care, so could something like GPT-3 be used to engage the patients, not probably who are dying, but who have been recently diagnosed with a serious illness, not to the purpose of influencing their decisions, but to engage them? Because generally the clinicians or the nurses or the counselors who work in this field shy away, while they have to pursue such difficult conversations, which involves existential meaning or death, where an AI could be a possible, not empathetic, but someone who is not very, how to put it more subtly, not very involved emotionally.
Okay, so I've made a note to go and look at the GPT-3 model. So this is what I love about research, because you learn something new from everything you do. So I don't know much about it, and I wasn't sure about, as you've just said, the patient possibly is not in a case where they're dying. But when you talk about difficult decisions, I don't know what GPT-3 does. Does it engage in conversation? Does it explain things better? I'm not sure. So possibly, to answer your question better, I need to have a look at this model, and then we need to have an email conversation. I'm really happy to do that, because I don't know enough to be able to answer the question. Is that okay? She's muted again.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'll be looking forward to talk about it.
Yeah. So drop me an email. I've wrote down your name, but just drop me an email if that's okay, and we can have that conversation. Okay.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you. Somebody said, can we use AI to build better communities of practice? Absolutely. Absolutely. But these need to be inclusive and diverse. A big thing at the moment is, particularly in the UK and imagine in many countries, COVID has revealed that we have a lot of digital poverty. We have people who simply can't afford laptops and mobile phones to do that kind of conversation, to have conversations, to keep connected, etc. And it's a global thing. And I think we need to tackle that issue first. But we also need to be able to add education and train people from a very, very early age. That sounds really awful, training people. We need to provide optional education so people understand about systems that they're going to use to apply for a loan, to apply for a mortgage, to go for a job. If that system is going to make a massive change on their lives by automatically rejecting them, a lot of people might say, well, okay, well, that's it. But actually, they have a right to find out why. And this is when we will uncover things that companies and businesses don't have processes in place to deal with it. So I really, really do think that AI can build better community practice, but we have to tackle digital poverty, and we have to provide education at the right level to everybody and be inclusive to all.
Thank you, ma'am. Any participant, if you want to ask, then you can ask.
Okay, so there's a question there about laws in place for intellectual property rights, and it's basically, I don't know of any for AI, but there are laws in place for intellectual property rights. And when we work with businesses, we have to do legal memorandums of understanding between that business and the technology we develop. On the iBorder Control project, I was working with the University of Hanover. Basically, there was a team of lawyers on that looking at this. And one of the big questions that were raised was, if we're going to explain our AI systems, then are we going to give away how our models work? And therefore, are we going to disclose some of our intellectual property rights? So there isn't. And what people are doing at the moment is, in Europe, we're looking towards that AI regulation that's coming out, because they're going to be asking for all this information to be stored in a central European database for high-risk systems. Will they cover some of these rights in that legislation? So I don't know, but I am working with German and London lawyers on understanding that as it comes out, because obviously I'm not a legal person as well, but it's fascinating and it does influence your research.
Okay, I think there is no more question. So once again, I am grateful to have you as a speaker, ma'am, and thank you so much for. And we are expecting that you will come to India and join with our offline session also. So in future, we are expecting that you will be a invited speaker in our university as offline. Okay, thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, and it'd be my privilege. I've also visited India before on research, so it would be my honor. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay.